Welcome to Flipping Tables, where we bring all of our religious thinking to Jesus, who flips the table for his upside-down kingdom. I'm Julie Sexton, and I'll be your host. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 33. This is the third episode in this Water with Lemon series, and here at the table, we are trying to hold on to summer just a little bit longer. I know everybody's back in school, and things are kind of moving us towards a fall schedule, but for these remaining weeks of summer, I'm inviting guests to the table to have what I hope are conversations that are both refreshing like a glass of ice water and maybe a little bit zesty like a lemon. Conversations that I hope will brighten your week and keep us in step with following the table flipper. My guest in this episode is Alva Skiles. She is actually Kimberly's aunt, and when I was making a list of guests for this summer series, Kimberly said, I think you need to talk to Aunt Alva. And I said, okay, well, tell me a little bit about Aunt Alva. I've met you, but I didn't know much about you. And so after she told me a little bit about you and your life of serving the Lord in ministry, I wondered why she hadn't mentioned you before. So Alva, I am excited to talk to you and welcome you to the table.
Well, I'm excited to be here. I was surprised when Kimberly asked me if I'd be interested, but it's a joy to be here.
That's funny. You're surprised she asked, and I was like surprised that she hadn't mentioned you before. I had no idea. I know we've met maybe in some summer Bible studies that we were doing at our home church that Kimberly and I both attend. And I know you live in the Richmond area.
Correct.
And I'd love for you to just take a few minutes and introduce yourself to our listeners. You have much more than Kimberly's aunt on your resume.
Being Kimberly's aunt is a big thing, but
it is a big thing.
And I never had a whole lot of chance to be around Kimberly very much in the past until I moved to Kentucky. Kimberly was in California and then Minnesota and then now in Kentucky. And I was usually in the Midwest. Well, what I consider the Midwest. People have different definitions of that term. But I was usually in Kansas or Iowa or places thereabouts. So I didn't get to be around her a whole lot. So it's been a joy to be closer by. But I am originally from central Kansas. And when I say central, there used to be a town called Kansas Center that was only 8 miles from our farm. So we are in the middle of the state of Kansas. Or I was, I'm not now. But I grew up on a farm, did all the usual farm things, like we had the big garden and canned all summer, and I milked the cows before school and did chores and all those kind of things. And I happened to have grown up in the same house that my mother grew up in.
That's amazing.
It is. Not very many people can say that anymore. I lived within 15 miles of both sets of grandparents, and some of my aunts and uncles and cousins were close by. Some were scattered throughout the state, but it was very unexpected to me that God would lead me to Kentucky to be here. But I've been in Kentucky since the summer of 19.
Okay.
And am here because my sister and her husband have been here about 25 years. He works for Lexmark. And my mother is now here with them. She came in 18. And when I retired, then I ended up in Kentucky as well. So
that's it's all kind of clicking and coming together for me, because I have been friends with Kimberly through all of this period, and before that, the boys are middle school, and Luke's a 5th grader, and little Clark, but they were toddlers. They were little when she and I became friends and started hanging out with, and kind of mentor-mentee relationship. But I remember praying for Grandma when Grandma moved, and I remember, her talking about her aunt was going to come and live. But she left out a lot of the details about this extraordinary life that you've lived. And I know we were talking before we started recording, like when you say central Kansas, I picture, because I've only been there in the summer when it's like July, and I think you said August is like the worst time to come through. But there's no fields doing wonderful things. It's just hot.
Yes.
And so the other time I've been there is like in December, and it was just really, really cold and snowy and things blowing. But I've not got to experience the real beauty that I think Kansas has.
It does have some real beauty.
I would love to enjoy those wide open spaces and that expanse of a sky. And growing up on a farm, I mean, that must have been just amazing.
It was amazing. I mean, I know I'm prejudiced, but I think wheat is one of the most beautiful crops there is. In the spring, because in Kansas we plant winter wheat.
Yes.
It's planted in the fall, it winters in the ground, and you know spring has come when you see this brilliant green patchwork quilt over the land. And I used to think there was no other color green like that I have seen at one other place, which was in the rice paddies in Thailand.
Okay.
When the rice comes up, it's the same color green. But, and then at harvest time, it's just golden. And seeing the giant combines go through the field and milo, or some people call it sorghum, is another beautiful crop. When I moved, at one point I moved to Iowa, and I said, farmers are farmers. The people are the same, but the crops, soybeans and corn, are just old dead plants at harvest time.
Right.
They don't look the same, you know, as wheat and milo do. But I know I'm prejudiced toward Kansas.
Well, I would love to see that side of Kansas, and green is one of my favorite colors. So you just perked my ears up when you described that, and having seen it also in Thailand. So can we talk a little bit about your faith journey?
Yes. I was very fortunate to have grown up with a number of family members who were very strong in their faith. My parents were both very active in the church, very strong in their faith. My grandfather and grandmother on my dad's side were part of the same church we were, and he was a deacon, and they were active in teaching and in music ministries and things like that. My dad's sister was the organist and pianist and choir director for our church, and very influential in her teaching and her influence as well. On my mom's side, there were a lot of strong faith people too, especially my mom's mother. My grandmother was a very amazing woman, and she had a big influence, I think, on all of her grandkids. But I remember, well, I don't so much remember the incident, but my mom talks about one time when there was an evangelist at our church when I was 5 years old. And she said, when they got ready to give the invitation, I pulled on the hem of her dress and said, "Is this when we go forward and ask Jesus into our heart?" And so it was just, for me, it was just a natural part of growing up, was being involved in the church and having that Christian influence. And so I'm very thankful. You know, I was spared a lot of things by not having the same kinds of struggles that a lot of people have. And that doesn't mean you know everything at a young age. I mean, there's still times when I said, if God has special education for spiritual learning, I'm in that class, because some things were a little slow to pick up on. But I was very blessed to have that influence when I was growing up. And even when I went to college, I went to Pittsburgh State University in Pittsburgh, Kansas. Kansas has 6 state schools, and Pitt State is one of them. The campus minister for the group I was in had been a pastor at our little church in central Kansas. So I knew the campus minister, and I knew a couple other people there on campus, and they had a very strong influence of, you know, through what can be a turbulent time for a lot of people in college. I had a very solid foundation as far as the people who were still pouring into my life. And God has just kept that up all along, that there's been a lot of people who have made a difference for me.
Well, you just painted a beautiful landscape of your life, your formative years into your college years, of just this legacy of faith and a God who was very, very active around you. And you can look back and see people who were strategically placed that were helping guide you onto a path that was going to lead you into being a missionary and into a career of ministry. So I would love now to talk about your life and your calling to be a missionary and what that looked like, where you went. And our listeners are probably like, I think it was Thailand, because she's already mentioned that. But yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
When I was in college, I started college pre-med because I've always had an interest in medical things. But while I was in college, it seemed like everything I was coming across as far as quiet times or Bible studies, everything, there was something in it about teaching. And I, at the time, I think that's when God was calling me into ministry, but I didn't recognize that at the time. So at the time, I took that to mean that I was supposed to change my major to education. And so I changed to biology education and then taught high school. And I was not the best teacher. I was too naive, for one thing. That wasn't exactly what God was calling me toward, And so I just taught for a short time, and then I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because I had a college friend who was down there and spent time down there and was part of a discipleship group that again, I got a lot of training and things through. But I decided then to go back to Pitt State and get my nursing degree. I had all the prerequisites. I just needed the nursing classes. And so I got my nursing degree. And then for a time I was in McPherson, Kansas, and working at the hospital there. It was a small town hospital, and there were a lot of things that were good preparation through that job because even though I was relatively new to nursing when I went to McPherson, being a small hospital, they needed somebody to work the evening shift part of the time on the med-surg floor and part of the time filling in for the nursing supervisor. So when I filled in for the supervisor 2 days a week, I if they were having a baby, I went to OB and helped there. If they needed something, a dinner break or needed assistance in ICU, I went to ICU and I got to get a lot of extra training, for ICU. If someone came into the emergency room, the ambulance was based at the hospital, so the EMTs would initially greet the person, but I went down to the emergency room and helped take care of that stuff. So I got to do a lot of different stuff and had my finger in a lot of different pieces of the pie, And that was great training because I did a little bit of everything. So while I was in McPherson, I was in a women's Bible study, and the leader of the Bible study had been a missionary in Africa. She and her husband was a physician who was at the hospital where I worked as well. And so I kind of got the mission bug,
Gotcha.
And I wrote to the Mission Society of our church and asked if I were to volunteer, what were the main places they might need me. The two options that they offered were either Haiti or Thailand, and I chose Thailand. I went to Thailand planning to be there for 2 years and was initially at a little hospital up in the northwest part of the hill country. And so initially that hospital had been the only hospital in the area. When I was there, there was a government hospital, but it catered mostly to the Thai people, whereas our hospital catered mostly to tribal people. There are lots of different tribal groups in Southeast Asia. And in many respects, they're treated much the same as the white man treated the Native Americans in the United States, where, if you're going to claim rights of citizenship or if you're going to go to school, you may have your given name, your tribal name, but you have to use a Thai name to be registered. And they've shuffled them around as far as what their territory is and things. And of course, the boundaries for the tribal groups are not the same as the boundaries for the countries. So, certain tribal groups may be in Thailand and Burma and South China, but, the country boundaries aren't necessarily in place for them. I mean, it's different.
Yeah.
So anyway, our hospital, a lot of the people were Po Karen and Ska Karen were the two primary tribes in that region. And so they also had, and medicine was very, by American standards, it was very primitive there. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had physicians. One physician was from Maine, one was from Sweden. The hospital was under Thailand Baptist Missionary Fellowship, which included people from Sweden, Great Britain, Australia, United States, from a number of different countries.
Right.
And we all worked together as one group, to help meet needs there. But having that varied background at McPherson was good preparation for there in Thailand. And then as my 2 years were coming to an end at the hospital, they needed somebody to fill in for a missionary who was going on home assignment at the New Life Center, which was a hostel for girls. The missionaries who initially set it up worked primarily with Lahu and Aka tribes, and they noticed how Thailand is known for its prostitutes and its sexual favors, although it's against the Buddhist religion to have multiple wives. You can have a temporary wife for one night, and that's okay.
Oh, wow.
And so there's also a lot of countries who come to Thailand specifically for sexual tours. Japan does, Germany does.
So it's actual tourism.
Yeah, it's a tourism factor.
Wow.
And they like the girls from the northern part of the country because here in the United States, if you have time to lay out at the beach and you're tan, that is an indication that you're more of a person of leisure. In Thailand or some of those countries in Southeast Asia, if you are very dark-skinned, it indicates you have worked in the fields and you've had to be out doing hard labor. Whereas if you're lighter-skinned, you haven't had to be in the fields, you can be inside. And so the girls in the northern part of the country had slightly lighter skin, so they liked the northern girls better than the southern girls. And and sometimes the girls were sold by their families, sometimes they're sold by the head man of the village they live in, sometimes they're sold by, just some random person. But the girls were in danger of being sold into prostitution. And the New Life Center was a place where the girls could be, if we knew about the situation, sometimes we could go and get the girls out of prostitution, or if they were in danger of being sold into that lifestyle, we could take them in at the New Life Center. And that way they could get an education, because many of them had never had any schooling. Mm-hmm. Sometimes on the government books, there's a school in a certain village. Mm-hmm. But if they send a young Thai teacher to the village, and the Thai teacher doesn't know the tribal language or the tribal customs, or doesn't like that place, they just leave. So there's a school on the books, but there's not a school there. So many of the girls had never had any education. They didn't know how to read and write their own language. They didn't have any marketable job skills other than just their bodies. And some of them had health issues that they needed to face. While I was there, the first girl who was HIV positive came to the New Life Center. And I went to a meeting while I was there. This was in Chiang Mai. And at the meeting I went to, they said there were only 6 cases of AIDS in the entire country. But when they told about the cases, it's like, well, that's garbage. One of the cases they counted was a child who was HIV positive in utero. They didn't count the mother. The mother had never left the village. It was through the father. They didn't count the father or the prostitute who infected the father. They only counted the baby. And there was a whole string prior to that. Mm-hmm. And so...
Why would they do that? What would be the advantage?
To make it look good, I suppose.
Our numbers are low. We don't have that problem.
However, within 6 months of that time, some of the brothels that they tested were 100% HIV positive.
Well, it probably would hurt their tourism.
Yeah.
If people knew that HIV was like widespread through, that would put a damper on their industry. Gosh, that is a horrifying existence.
Yeah.
And I know I told you that I, am passionate about anti-human trafficking, and you just painted this picture of this. What years were you in?
87 to 90.
That's what I was wondering, if it was like in the 80s.
Yeah.
And that was, I grew up in the 80s, and that was just that whole, HIV was such a new thing that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And, wow. So you all were able to help get them training and education and hopefully some freedom.
Yeah, hopefully.
So when you, when you were talking, I just have to say, I was thinking about Moses, and I was thinking about how God, positioned him in Pharaoh's household, and he got that incredible education, and he had all of these experience, vast and wide, and how that became all so important in the work that he would do.
Yes.
And so when you were just describing your going from pre-med to education to nursing, and then being in all these different fields and areas of nursing, all this experience that was preparing you for this role.
Yes.
And also for the other roles that you had. So when you came back to the United States, I believe you went back to Kansas.
Yes.
Correct? And when you were in Kansas, talk to me about how you ended up going to seminary.
When I came back, shortly before I came back, my father had been diagnosed with lung cancer.
Okay.
Which was no surprise. Both of his parents died of cancer. He was a smoker, farming before there were cabs on the tractors. I mean, all of it worked together. And he had been given a fairly short period of time that he was supposed to live. He lived about 4 years, which far exceeded the time that they had given him. But I wanted to be close to my parents at that point in time. Yeah. So I started working at a hospital in Lawrence, Kansas, which I know Lawrence and Lexington are... Kansas University and Kentucky University are foes. But anyway.
That is true, right? Yes.
Anyway. But while I was there, my father died in 94, the summer of 94. And about that time, a pastor friend and I were talking. He was getting ready to relocate to a different church. And as we were talking, he said, I think God is calling you to go to seminary. I had never even considered that before. But as soon as he said it, it's like, yeah, that's true.
Isn't it amazing how you just knew?
Yeah.
You're just like, that's what he's been calling me to do, to teach.
Yeah.
To go to seminary. Wow.
So yeah, you can... in hindsight, we're a lot smarter than we are in foresight.
We so much are.
But
we have to get like a degree in our life so that we can understand our life.
Yeah. So as we were talking, that was the summer of 94 when we were talking. And so Central Baptist Theological Seminary is in Kansas City. It was within driving distance of Wellsville, where I was living. And so I started classes that fall, And initially, although I knew I was supposed to go to seminary, I don't think the full ramifications of being a pastor had entered my head yet, but they did shortly, because I started seminary, and the area minister had this little church that had just gone through a divide. It was just very small at the time, and they needed somebody, and it was within driving distance of both where I lived and of the school. So I started pastoring this little church while I was in seminary. I couldn't imagine that somebody would want me to be their pastor, but...
How old were you at this time?
How old? Let's see, 94, I would have been 43.
Okay.
Yeah, 43 at that time. So it had been, from when I first was hearing about teaching in college, I mean, I would have been in my 20s then, and here I am in my 40s at this point in time. But I always knew that I would be in a small church, because in a small church, you have to kind of be a jack of all trades. You have to do a little of everything.
You didn't have like a big staff, a pastor.
I was the only staff.
You're like, I am the staff.
Yeah, there was no secretary. There was no other staff. It was just me. I was the only staff on, for the church. Like, one of the things that this little church was worried about was, in the split, a lot of their leadership had left, but they were worried because the pianist had left. And it's like, I'm not worried about that part. I got a lot of other things that I have to figure out and work on, Mm-hmm. Don't worry about the pianist part. We'll take care of that, So you just have to be ready, if they need somebody to teach the Sunday school lesson, if they need somebody to do other things, to lead the singing or to play the piano or to, write a script for the kids' play at Christmas time or something, you just have to be ready to do a little bit of everything. And so that was my first church, was that little one. And eventually they did end up closing because so much of their leadership had gone. But, transitioning them through from having been a larger church through the split, through the closure and all those things, in some ways those kind of went along with the nursing thing, because, you had
a lot of hearts to tend to.
Yeah.
What were you majoring in seminary? What was the
just basically pastoral studies.
Okay.
I didn't focus on a language or any of those things. It was mostly pastoral ministry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
after you did that, in that church, you kind of ended up pastoring a number of churches after that.
Yeah, they were all small churches in northeast Kansas, kind of outlying from the Kansas City area. Yeah. But and all of them were in Kansas except for the last church that I pastored. For 11 years, I was at New Confidence Church in Confidence, Iowa. And they had a connection to a church not terribly far from here in Kentucky.
Really?
So, yeah. So anyway, it was, and interestingly enough, the area minister, or the person in charge of Iowa, Minnesota churches within our denomination, was someone who I had met initially in Chiang Mai in Thailand, who showed me how to do the bookkeeping for the New Life Center on the computer, because he was a computer geek. And so I had the connection, in Iowa clear back to when I was in Thailand.
You just kind of scripted it. You just couldn't plan your life like that.
No, you couldn't.
Wow, that's amazing. So when you were in seminary, I'm so curious about this. Were there a lot of women studying?
There were quite a few women. In the Kansas City area, there's a consortium of seminaries, the American Baptist, Southern Baptist, St. Paul is Methodist, the Nazarene, and the Presbyterian Seminary. There's a consortium of those 5 that kind of work together. And during the time that I was in seminary, the person who became the president of the seminary was a woman minister, Molly Marshall. And so we had a number of women in seminary at that time. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And did you stay in the American Baptist denomination? Is that...
Yeah, that's the church. The church I grew up in was
Yes.
American Baptist, and most of my life I've been in American Baptist churches. When I was teaching in Perry, Kansas, they didn't have a Baptist church, so I went to the Methodist church so that I could stay right there in town. Because to me, it was more important to be worshiping in the community where I lived.
Yes.
So yeah, most of the time, other than when I was in Perry and then here, because there aren't a lot of American Baptists. Well, you have to go a ways to get to an American Baptist church in this area.
Right.
So yeah, most of my life I've been an American Baptist.
That's so interesting. I love hearing about your journey and how God was, moving you around, and how it took you a while to figure out what He was calling you to do. But I know for me, when I felt like the Lord called me to teach, that was really all He said. And it was like, oh, but what do I do now? Because I was married and I had a toddler and a baby, and I couldn't imagine going back to school and doing that. And so I just felt like the Lord was like, I will teach you. Like, you're going to take care of teaching your children. And people have heard me say that on the podcast before, but I always wondered if I was doing it right. Like, I wondered, am I doing what the Lord wants me to do? And I was always so cautious about stepping into new roles and transitioning. And I could see the ways that He was teaching me. But then I was like, am I living up to my part? Like, what am I supposed to be doing with this? And, He led me to serve in the local church. He led me to serve in Bible Study Fellowship. And I think you're still a member of Bible Study Fellowship.
Yes, I am.
And, just great ministry, a great place of training and learning and being equipped. But I would love for you to kind of speak into women who are listening to the podcast, and how you might encourage young women who might be considering going into vocational ministry, or how women who were like me, that were like, whoa, I started my life and then I got this calling, and I can't imagine leaving my kids so that I can do seminary. So how would you encourage women?
God uses a lot of different methods and a lot of different pathways to get ministry done, because there are so many different kinds of ministry.
Absolutely.
And on the one hand, I think, there was 20 years. What could I have done in those 20 years before I recognized what my call was? But, God does prepare us. And maybe we would have done it different if we planned it. But usually if we plan it, or at least me, if I plan it, I usually mess it up.
Me too.
I don't get it right. And so two of my favorite Bible characters are ones that you don't hear a whole lot about, Shiphrah and Puah. In early Exodus, when Pharaoh called the midwives,
I was so excited when you said that. I was like, are you going to talk about the midwives?
Yes.
Let's talk about the midwives.
When Pharaoh called the midwives and said, there's too many of these Hebrew people. We need to cut back on these because they could mess us up really bad. And he told the midwives, you need to get rid of the boys because they could be fighting army. They were slaves. They were midwives, which that's considered an unclean profession because you've got the issue of blood. And so they're always dealing with some woman's blood. They were unclean. So they had a critical role in the life of the women, but, theologically speaking, that's not a desirable profession. And yet, we don't even have the name of the Pharaoh that gave the order. We've got the name of some slave, unclean women. And the women stood up and said, no, that's not what God wants us to do. But if we didn't have those women doing their job to follow God, Moses would have been put to death, and you wouldn't have Moses leading the people out of slavery and crossing the Red Sea and doing some of the tremendous things that even today the Hebrew people look back on as this is a critical point in their history. So sometimes you're called to be a spokesperson. Sometimes you're called to be more behind the scenes, but it's a critical role. And God uses your life experiences, and God can use, the profession, whether you're bivocational or one vocation or whatever. God can use those things to touch lives in dramatic ways that further advance the kingdom of God. And there's so many different possibilities. I think of some of the missionaries that I worked with in Thailand. Some of them were translating scriptures and translating educational materials. Some of them were hospital people. Some of them were the technological geeks who were taking care of, bringing out more computer use and how to do those things. Mm-hmm. Some of them, having grown up on a farm, some of the plowed land that people farmed on, it went straight up and down the mountain like at a 45-degree angle.
Right.
And I thought, man, even in Kansas we do terracing and contour plowing, and these people need some agronomy education. There's so many different things. I mean, that's just a smattering of the possibilities. There's so many different ways that God needs people to take a stand and to be his light, to advance the call of the kingdom, that none of it's going to be wasted if you hand it over to God and say, God, this is what I want. There are times when I wish I was married. I wish I had kids. I remember my 30th birthday. I was in nursing school. I was a staff resident, in the dorm, and I had 30 freshman girls on my floor that I was responsible for. And I thought, man, this is not where I thought I'd be at this point in my life, responsible for freshman girls in the dorm. I thought I'd be in a little gingerbread house with a picket fence and kids, Mm-hmm. But that's where God put me. And so you go where God puts you and you say, what can I learn? What can I do in the midst of this situation?
That's good advice. Such good advice. And every role is important.
Yes.
And the people, I think so many people want to pursue a platform, but it's all these people behind the scenes mm-hmm. that are doing all of this work.
Yeah.
That you don't realize that person can't do what they're doing without all of these other people.
Right.
And we actually need more in this garden variety of just being faithful. I think what I would tell people, and what I do tell women, is to just show up in the spaces that you're in mm-hmm. and see how you can improve it. Mm-hmm. How can you, raising my children, I thought that was, of course, it's going to be funny, but I thought, God, that is such an interesting call that you've called me to teach. And then you're like, okay, focus on your kids. Focus on raising your daughters. And he just gave me this expanded view of that role became so much more sacred and so much more holy to think I'm raising girls who I hope will be women who will lead and be useful in advancing the kingdom in their generation. Mm-hmm. And what a privilege, because at some point somebody is going to be the last generation.
True.
And we should be investing wholeheartedly in our children, if we have children, but you had spiritual children. You had
Yes.
all of these young women and people that you were responsible for in shepherding a church and a congregation. And being a jack of all trades, as you describe yourself, and having to do all of these different roles, you probably weren't like, this is glamorous. Would you describe it as like,
No.
but it was, you didn't think, I really just want to do this one position over any of the others, right?
There's times you wish you could focus on one particular aspect more than others, but I enjoy variety. I mean, like I like to, when I would go into town even, I would go one way going into town and a different way coming home because I wanted to see what was going on in the area and see whose car's at the restaurant and who's having coffee at the coffee shop. And
I love that.
I need variety.
Yeah.
And God, that's the way God made me. But so within ministry, having variety, I mean, I enjoyed that too.
I enjoyed it too, because when I think about how I've served in the local church, sometimes it's been in children's ministry, sometimes it was in youth ministry, then it was women's ministry, being a part of a mission team, going on short-term mission trips, being a VBS leader and hosting VBS and just all these different roles, being a shepherd in like Bible study fellowship and leading group discussions. And in this very room that we're sitting in, which is my living room in my home, I've had so many Bible studies, so many book studies, so many just prayer meetings and worship times with small groups of people in this room. And I don't look at it and say, this was when I was living out my call. All of that has been living out my call. Now that I'm recording a podcast, it's all part of the call. It's all about living up to this calling to teach other people how to follow Jesus.
Yes.
And to be, real and transparent about my life. And I feel like you have done that probably in your life, just because I know one of the things that you had said to me was allow yourself to be open and vulnerable before others. That's mentoring. That's making disciples.
To let them know that you're a real person, you have real struggles. You're not perfect.
Absolutely not.
But, God will see you through it, and that gives them encouragement to know, I don't have to be perfect, and God still loves me, God still cares for me, and He has a way to get me through this.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I asked you if you had a life verse, and you gave me 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 and 25, and I'm going to read this, and I think this is out of the NASB version. The bondservant of the Lord must not be quarrelsome, but kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, if God should grant them opportunity to repent. So tell me, what about these verses has made them a life verse or a guide?
Probably, I don't remember exactly when that became my life verse, but it was fairly early on. And probably one of the first things that attracted me to the verse was able to teach, because that's what God had been talking to me about. Then also the fact of being a bondservant, that a bondservant is someone who has been enslaved, and out of the graciousness of their master, they were given freedom. They were liberated. But they learned soon that living with that master, who was a good master, was better than anything that they could do on their own, and they have chosen to stay in service in that master's home, or, as part of his household. And just the way God frees us from slavery, different people have different kinds of slavery. For some people it is a very literal, enslavement, or they're, addicted to alcohol or drugs, or there's so many different things that can enslave us. And through God, we have liberty. We've been set free, just as Moses took the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt and they were given freedom. But finding out that it's better to give my life over to this God and continue to live in this household rather than go out on my own. So the bondservant aspect. And it just at different times, different parts of the verse come out, sometimes. Now, I at one time would have never described myself as quarrelsome, but I know I am at times, that I need to not nitpick or not react in a human way, but seek what is God trying to teach or trying to do in this situation. I had told you earlier that one time when I looked up my name, that the meaning of the name Alva is beloved friend of all. And so the phrase about being kind to all goes along with that, so that's an attraction. Just at different points in my life, there's different phrases from that verse that have really stood out to me. And that just is a verse that God gave me decades ago as a life verse.
Yeah, it's a great verse to guide. And I love how different seasons, different words have hit you. And I mean, that's the word of God, right? It's living and active, and we don't master any part of it. We want to be mastered by it. We want to be faithful and loyal to his call. And you just think about Jesus, and we call him around here the table flipper, but he welcomed everybody at tables.
Yes.
And he sometimes had disciples who were squabbling, who were quarrelsome with one another, who were struggling to be kind to outsiders and even children, and, not wanting Jesus to be bothered by ministry, basically, right? Like, this ministry, Jesus, is really getting in the way of you teaching us. And he's like, I am trying to teach you how to be a servant. And he, as their Lord, wore that servanthood and served them and taught them. And I pulled up in Mark 10 where he says in verses 42 to 43, Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave to all." Must be a bondservant. Such a picture. That's what he taught them. And when I just thought of that when I love the Gospels. I love hanging out with Jesus in the Gospels and just looking so closely at the way he did ministry and trying to model my life after him. So it has been such an honor to have you, a trailblazer, a table flipper, being a missionary, being a pastor, a shepherd of God's people, and you're really inspiring, Alva.
Well, thank you.
And that's a beautiful testimony of a faithful life that you have shared with us today at the table, and I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
So here at the table, we like to wrap up with a bright spot. And Alva, I would love for you to just share a bright spot with our audience.
The first thing that came to mind as far as a bright spot was recently my sister, Kimberly's mom, often is in charge of crafts at Bible school. And a couple of years in a row, I've helped with the crafts when they had Bible school. And this year, a mother who knew Tammy and Tom from previous times had asked if Tom would be something of a mentor or be a positive male role model to her son. And so they have met with him. They've done some things with Kimberly's boys. They've, done different things. They went to a movie together, and they had asked him if he needed some school clothes, and he didn't think he needed any, but his mom said, if that offer's still open, could you get him some school clothes? So yesterday, they took him out and they went to a couple different stores in Richmond and were able to get him some school clothes so that he's better ready to go to school. And, he's having that positive male image, not
So
a
good.
abandoned father situation, but Tom's been able to do a lot, and Tammy as well.
I love it.
Make a difference in his life.
That's wonderful. They're wonderful people, and this legacy of faith. We've had Luke on the podcast, Kimberly's on the podcast, and your family is such a long, strong line of faith, and it's just really an honor. I love this story. I love your bright spot. And when I thought about my bright spot, I have to go back to the last couple of weeks just watching the Olympics.
Yes.
And, when the Olympics started and we were just getting ready to go on vacation the next day, and Kimberly and I love the Olympics, and we're just such sisters in that we were, but the opening ceremonies, there was just a lot of controversy around them, and they just seemed to be mocking our faith in Christianity. And I was very quiet about that, and I don't want to speak about it. But what I want to say is what I loved about the Olympics was that Jesus was very much a part of the Olympics.
Indeed, yes.
When these athletes, so many of them were giving praise to Jesus. People were crossing marathons and were making the sign of the cross when they won. And it was so incredibly beautiful. But my favorite was when Cole Hawker won the gold medal in the 1,500 meter race, and he set an Olympic record. And this was a major upset. And his U.S. Teammate, Nugis, he took the bronze, and, there was this kind of prideful, guy from, I think, maybe Norway or say yes. And so I was just when he passed him, and I remember in an interview, Noogie saying that Cole had said, "When I kick, you kick," and they just soared.
Yeah. And
his testimony at the end of that race was, "God carried me across that finish line." And there were so many, of course, the Sydney McLaughlins, and just these beautiful testimonies. And I said, Jesus, we don't have to defend Jesus. And when Jesus is mocked, Jesus doesn't get upset. He is the Savior of the world. And there were so many people praising him.
Yes.
And I thoroughly enjoyed the Olympics.
Yes.
And that has been a real bright spot. And I'm a little sad that they're over. But again, as we like to say around here, listeners, don't worry about what the world's doing. Keep your eyes on Jesus and keep following the table flipper, and leave the table flipping to Jesus.